The evening air in New York City was crisp and biting, the kind of cold that cuts right through a jacket and settles deep in your bones. It was a Tuesday night, but the streets felt like a chaotic Friday. Thousands of people were rushing from the subway stations, heads down, eyes glued to their phone screens, eager to get home to their warm apartments or to meet friends at a crowded bar. The city noise was a constant hum of car horns, sirens, and the chatter of strangers, a soundtrack that most locals had learned to tune out completely. Moving through this tide of busy people was a man who stood out simply because he didn't seem to be in a hurry. He walked with a steady, calm pace, blending into the background despite the fact that millions of people knew his face. To the casual observer, he looked like any other guy trying to navigate the sidewalk. He was wearing a dark, heavy coat that had seen better days, a simple beanie pulled down low over his hair, and worn-out boots that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards, and he wasn't wearing sunglasses to hide his identity. He was just Keanu, a man enjoying a solitary walk in the city he loved. As he turned the corner onto a slightly quieter street, the smell of grilled meat and spices hit him. It was the aroma of street food, the kind that smells better than anything else when you are hungry and tired. Keanu paused for a moment, scanning the area. He saw a small food truck parked near the curb, its windows glowing with warm yellow light. A line of people had formed, waiting for their orders of tacos and burgers. Steam was rising from the grills, disappearing into the dark night sky. He decided this was where he would eat tonight. It wasn't a fancy restaurant with white tablecloths and waiting staff, but it felt real. It felt human. He stepped into the back of the line, keeping his hands buried deep in his coat pockets to protect them from the chill. He didn't check his phone or look around anxiously. He just stood there, watching the city life unfold around him. While he waited, his eyes drifted across the street. That is when he noticed him. Just a few feet away from the bright light of the food truck, sitting on the cold concrete, was a man who looked like he had been there for hours. He was wearing a thin, torn jacket that offered almost no protection against the freezing wind. His pants were dirty, and his shoes were falling apart. He had a small, crumpled cardboard sign sitting in front of him, but the writing was faded and hard to read from a distance. Most people walking by didn't even look at him. It was a sad reality of the city. People would step around him, swerving to avoid his outstretched legs, treating him like a pothole in the road rather than a human being. Some looked annoyed that he was taking up space on the sidewalk. Others pretended to be fascinated by something in the distance just to avoid making eye contact. The man sat there, staring at the ground, his shoulders slumped forward in defeat. He looked small and invisible. Keanu watched the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. He wasn't just looking, he was paying attention. He noticed how the man shivered violently as a strong gust of wind blew down the street. He noticed how the man rubbed his hands together trying to create some heat, but it wasn't working. The actor saw the exhaustion in the man's posture, the kind of tiredness that doesn't go away after a good night's sleep. It was the tiredness of someone fighting to survive every single day. The line at the food truck moved forward, but Keanu's attention remained fixed on the figure across the pavement. He looked at the bustling, happy people ordering their food and then back at the man who had nothing. The contrast was painful. Here was a city full of wealth and noise, but right there on the sidewalk, there was silence and hunger. Keanu shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't famous right now in this moment, he was just a bystander witnessing a struggle. The food truck vendor called out, "Next in line." Keanu stepped forward, but instead of looking at the menu board, he turned his body slightly so he could keep watching the man on the curb. He felt a pull in his chest, a familiar feeling of empathy that he often tried to keep private. He knew that money wasn't always the answer, and he knew that people on the street were often ignored or judged. But looking at this specific man, something felt different. It wasn't just about giving $1 to make himself feel better. It felt like there was a real human connection waiting to happen, if only someone would take the time to stop. The wind picked up again, rattling the metal sides of the food truck. The homeless man pulled his knees up to his chest, trying to preserve whatever little body heat he had left. He looked so alone in the middle of the crowded city. Keanu took a deep breath of the cold air. He knew he couldn't just walk away with a hot meal in his hand while this man sat freezing in the dark. He didn't know what he was going to say yet, and he didn't have a grand plan. He just knew he couldn't ignore it. The atmosphere on the street felt charged suddenly, as if the world was waiting to see what would happen next between the movie star and the stranger on the ground. Keanu stepped up to the small serving window of the food truck. The inside of the truck was hot and chaotic, with the cook flipping burgers and shouting orders over the sound of the sizzling grill. The air was thick with the delicious smell of fried onions and melting cheese. Keanu waited patiently, his hands still resting in his pockets, while the people in front of him received their food and hurried away. When it was finally his turn, he leaned in slightly and gave the vendor a small, polite nod. He ordered a simple burger and a coffee, nothing fancy. He wasn't looking for a feast, he just wanted something to fill his stomach and keep him warm. While he waited for his change, he turned his head again. The man on the sidewalk hadn't moved. He was still shivering, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. Keanu noticed that the man wasn't looking at the people passing by anymore, he was staring intently at the steam rising from the grill vent on the side of the truck. It was a look of pure longing. He wasn't looking at the people, he was looking at the warmth. That small detail stuck with Keanu. It was a reminder that for some people, food isn't just about taste or hunger, it is about survival and heat. Keanu took his cup of coffee and the small paper bag with his burger. He turned away from the window, intending to find a quiet spot to stand and eat. But before he could take a step, something happened. The homeless man shifted his position. He cleared his throat, a raspy, dry sound that cut through the noise of the street. He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes met Keanu's. The man didn't know he was a movie star. He didn't know he was famous or wealthy. In that moment, Keanu was just another person in a warm coat holding food. Most people would have looked away or picked up their pace to avoid an awkward conversation. But Keanu didn't move. He stood still, holding his coffee, and looked back at the man with a calm expression. He didn't look annoyed or scared. He just looked present. The man seemed surprised by this. Usually, when he tried to speak to someone, they would ignore him or walk faster. But this stranger was actually listening. The man's voice was shaky and quiet, difficult to hear over the traffic. He didn't launch into a long story about how he got there. He didn't make up a lie about needing bus fare to get to a sick relative. He looked Keanu in the eye and spoke with a raw, brutal honesty that stops people in their tracks. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking a little. "I don't want to bother you. I know you're busy. But..." He paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "I don't want any money. I promise you, I don't want money." Keanu tilted his head slightly, listening closer. It was rare to hear someone say they didn't want money. Usually, that was the first thing people asked for. The man continued, his eyes drifting down to the paper bag in Keanu's hand before looking back up. It's just been a really cold day, the man said, wrapping his thin jacket tighter around himself. I haven't eaten in 2 days. I don't need cash for anything else. I just need a warm meal. That's all. Just something hot to put in my stomach. The words hung in the cold air between them. I just need a warm meal. There was no anger in his voice, and there was no demand. It was a simple plea from one human being to another. He was admitting his vulnerability without shame, but also with a sense of dignity. He wasn't begging for handouts to waste, he was asking for the basic fuel to keep going. It stripped away all the judgments and stereotypes that people often have about the homeless. He wasn't looking for a way out of his life right at that second, he was just looking for a way to get through the night. Keanu stood frozen for a second. The request hit him differently than a simple request for change ever could. It was specific. It was real. He looked at the burger in his hand, which was now starting to cool down slightly. He looked at the coffee, steam still rising from the small hole in the lid. Then he looked back at the man. He saw the dirt on his face and the tiredness in his eyes, but he also saw the spark of hope that had flared up when he asked the question. The actor didn't say anything immediately. He didn't flash a charming Hollywood smile or try to make a big scene. Instead, his face grew serious. He shifted his weight, turning his body fully toward the man on the ground. The noise of the city seemed to fade into the background for both of them. The rushing pedestrians, the honking cars, the sirens in the distance, it all became white noise. In that small circle of light from the food truck, only the two of them existed. Keanu looked down at the food in his hands and then back at the man. He realized that eating a burger in front of someone who hadn't eaten in 2 days wasn't something he could do. It wasn't about guilt, it was about empathy. He saw a fellow human being who was hurting, and he had the power to stop that hurt, even if just for a few hours. The man watched Keanu's face closely, looking for a sign of rejection. He expected Keanu to apologize and walk away. He expected to be ignored again. He braced himself for the cold shoulder he was so used to receiving. But he didn't turn away. He kept his eyes on Keanu, waiting for an answer. A small silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the wind whipping around the corner of the truck. It was a moment of decision. Keanu could have kept walking, enjoyed his dinner, and gone about his life. No one would have blamed him. But as he looked at the shivering man, hearing the echo of those words, I just need a warm meal, something clicked inside him. He wasn't going to walk away. He was going to stay. And he was going to do more than just listen. The simple honesty of the request had stirred something in him, a desire to act, to help, to connect in a real way. The night was about to take a very different turn than a quiet dinner alone. The silence that followed the man's request didn't last long, but in those few seconds, the atmosphere shifted completely. Keanu didn't stare at the man with pity, and he didn't look away uncomfortably. Instead, his face softened, his expression turning from serious to determined. He didn't say anything at first, just gave a short, firm nod. It was a nod that said, "I heard you, and I've got this." He didn't treat the request like a burden, he treated it like a mission. Without wasting another second, Keanu turned his back to the man and stepped right back up to the serving window of the food truck. The vendor was just handing a drink to another customer, but Keanu leaned in to get his attention. He didn't whisper or try to hide what he was doing, but he didn't shout for everyone to look at him either. He kept his voice low and steady. "Excuse me," Keanu said, interrupting the noise of the grill. "I need to change my order." "Can you make that 2 meals, please, and make the second one the biggest one you have. Load it up with everything, double meat, cheese, whatever makes it filling." The vendor looked a bit surprised, wiping his hands on his apron. He glanced past Keanu at the man sitting on the cold sidewalk, then back at the actor. A small look of realization crossed his face, but he didn't make a big deal out of it. He just nodded and got to work. "Sure thing, boss. Coming right up." Keanu stood by the window, waiting for the food to be prepared. The smell of the cooking meat was intoxicating, and he knew it must be torture for the man sitting just a few feet away who had an empty stomach. While he waited, Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was a worn leather wallet, simple and unassuming. He opened it up, not checking his balance or counting coins, but simply pulling out a stack of bills. They weren't single-dollar bills. He took out a mix of 20s and 50s, a significant amount of money for anyone, let alone someone handing it out on a street corner. But Keanu knew that money on the street can be dangerous. If you hand cash to someone openly, others might see it and try to take it. It puts a target on the person's back. So, he was careful. He discreetly folded the bills, making sure they were compact but easy to recognize. He waited until the vendor passed over the 2 paper bags, steam rising from the top, and the 2 cups of hot coffee. Keanu took the bags, testing the weight of them. He felt the warmth radiating through the paper against his palms. It was a freezing night, and that heat was precious. He carefully slipped the folded stack of money underneath the wrapper of the burger in the second bag. He hid it so the man wouldn't see it immediately and so no one passing by would see it flashing in the light. He wanted the gift to be a surprise for later, a safety net for the man that no one else knew about. Now that he had the food, the real moment began. Most people in this situation would simply walk over, hand the bag down from a standing height, and say God bless before hurrying away. It creates a distance, a giver and a receiver dynamic. But Keanu did something different. He turned around and walked the few steps toward the man on the sidewalk. The man on the ground watched him approach, his eyes wide. He still didn't understand what was happening. He probably thought Keanu was just going to sit nearby to eat, or perhaps he was coming to tell him to move along. The man flinched slightly as Keanu got closer, a reflex built from being treated poorly by so many others. Keanu didn't stop at a safe distance. He walked right up to the man, and then, to the surprise of everyone watching, he crouched down. He didn't squat awkwardly, he went all the way down, resting the heels of his boots on the dirty pavement and bringing his knees up so he was eye to eye with the seated stranger. This action lowered himself from the status of a successful actor to the level of a man who had nothing. It stripped away any hierarchy. By sitting on the dirty ground in his expensive clothes, Keanu was saying, "We are the same." The wind was blowing, but the little space between them felt warm now. Keanu held out one of the steaming bags and the hot coffee. "Here you go, man," Keanu said softly. His voice was gentle, carrying over the sound of the wind. "I got you the double cheeseburger. It's hot. Eat up." The man stared at the bag, then at Keanu, then back at the bag. His hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from the shock of the moment. He reached out slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid it might disappear if he moved too fast. When his fingers wrapped around the warm bag, he pulled it toward his chest immediately. The heat soaked into his hands, and his shoulders dropped as some of the tension left his body. "Thank you," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you so much." Keanu shook his head, brushing off the thanks as if it were unnecessary. He took a sip of his own coffee and looked at the man with a genuinely concerned expression. He wasn't in a rush to leave. He didn't check his watch. He stayed there, on the ground, making sure the man was okay. He watched as the man opened the bag, the smell of the food hitting his face. The man didn't start eating immediately, he just held the burger, letting the warmth seep into his frozen fingers. The contrast was stark. On one side, a man who had the world at his fingertips, sitting on a dirty sidewalk. On the other, a man who had lost everything, holding a treasure of a meal. Yet, in that moment, the line between them vanished. There was no movie star and homeless man. There were just two people sharing a moment of kindness on a cold night. As the man took his first bite, closing his eyes in relief, Keanu stayed there. He knew the money was hidden in the bottom of the bag, waiting to be found later, but for now, the focus was on the warm meal. The man chewed slowly, savoring every bite, a look of pure peace washing over his face. Keanu watched him eat, a small smile playing on his lips, knowing that the simple act of buying dinner had just made a bigger difference than any blockbuster movie ever could. He had done exactly what was asked. He provided a warm meal, but he had done it in a way that gave the man back his dignity. The man took his first bite of the burger, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The hot food hit his empty stomach, and the relief was almost instant. His shoulders, which had been hunched up against the cold for hours, finally dropped an inch. He closed his eyes for a second, just letting the taste of the food and the warmth of the coffee wash over him. It wasn't just nutrition, it was comfort. It was a signal to his body that he was going to be okay for at least one more night. Keanu didn't stand up and leave. He didn't hand over the food and walk away with a feeling of self-satisfaction. Instead, he stayed right there on the dirty sidewalk, balancing his own coffee cup on his knee. He watched the man eat with a look of quiet contentment, as if he were having dinner with an old friend rather than a stranger he had just met on the street. He took a sip of his own drink, the steam rising up and framing his face in the dim light. "Is it good?" Keanu asked gently. His tone wasn't condescending, like an adult asking a child if he liked his vegetables. It was a genuine question, asked from one person to another. The man swallowed hard and nodded vigorously, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "It's amazing," he said, his voice a little stronger now that he had something in his system. "Really? It's the best thing I've tasted in a long time. Thank you. I love this truck," Keanu replied, leaning back on one hand, getting comfortable on the pavement. "They never skimp on the sauce. That's the secret." The man let out a small, surprised laugh. It was a rusty sound, like a door that hadn't been opened in a while. "Yeah, you're right about that. The sauce is good." For the next few minutes, the city chaos continued to swirl around them, but they existed in a small, calm bubble. People walked by, some glancing down at the odd sight of a well-dressed man sitting on the ground next to a homeless man, but Keanu didn't notice them. He wasn't performing for a camera. He wasn't doing this for publicity. He was just there. The man ate slower now, the initial desperate hunger fading into a steady rhythm. He looked over at Keanu, curiosity mixed with gratitude in his eyes. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "Most people, they just walk by. Or they throw a quarter and don't even look at you. You sat down." Keanu looked at him, his face open and serious. "Why wouldn't I sit down? You're a person, just like me. We're both just trying to get through the night, right?" It was a simple sentence, but it carried a massive weight. To the man on the sidewalk, Being treated as an equal was worth more than all the money in the world. He was so used to being invisible, a ghost in the city machine, that being seen was overwhelming. He nodded, his eyes getting a bit shiny, though he tried to hide it by taking another drink of the hot coffee. "It's just been a rough week," the man admitted, his voice dropping low. He didn't go into a sad story or try to guilt-trip Keanu. He just stated a fact. "The weather turned cold fast. My shoes got soaked yesterday, and I couldn't get them dry. It makes it hard to keep your spirits up when your feet are numb." Keanu looked down at the man's shoes. They were falling apart, the canvas torn and the soles worn thin. It was a painful sight, seeing how little protection the man had against the elements. Keanu didn't offer empty platitudes like "it will get better" or "keep your head up." He knew that sometimes life just hurts, and fake positivity doesn't help. Instead, he offered solidarity. "Cold is tough," Keanu agreed, rubbing his own hands together. "Even with a good coat, this wind cuts right through you. I don't know how you manage it. You're tougher than you look." That small compliment made the man stand a little taller, even while sitting down. He wasn't being pitied, he was being respected for his survival. They sat there for a while longer, talking about the weather and the city, normal everyday things that the man rarely got to discuss with anyone. They joked about the crazy traffic on the street corner and how the food truck smelled better than any five-star restaurant. At one point, a young couple walked by. They recognized Keanu immediately. Their eyes went wide, and they stopped in their tracks, whispering to each other and pointing. They started to pull out their phones, probably wanting a selfie. Keanu saw them. He gave them a quick, polite smile and put a finger to his lips, asking for silence. He subtly gestured to the man beside him. The couple understood instantly. They put their phones away, smiled warmly at the scene, and quietly walked on. They respected the moment, realizing that this wasn't a movie premiere, this was a private moment of connection. The man with the burger didn't notice any of this. He was focused on the food and the conversation. He reached deep into the bag to grab the last few fries, his fingers brushing against the thick stack of paper Keanu had hidden at the bottom. The man paused. He pulled his hand out and saw the money folded there. His hand froze. He stared at the bills, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at the money, then up at Keanu, his eyes wide with shock. "Sir. I don't, this is too much. I can't take this." Keanu just shook his head calmly, taking a sip of his coffee. "It's not for you to argue with me," he said with a soft smile. "Consider it a tip. Or a rainy day fund. You said it's been a rough week. Maybe this helps next week be a little better." The man looked at the money again. It was enough to get him a room for a few nights, or a new pair of boots, or just decent food for a long time. It was a lifeline. But more than the money, it was the way it was given. It wasn't thrown at him. It was hidden with care, given with dignity, so he didn't have to feel ashamed accepting it. "Thank you," the man whispered again, his voice trembling with emotion. "I won't forget this. I promise." "You don't have to promise anything," Keanu said, finishing his coffee and crushing the cup slightly. "Just eat. Get warm. That's all that matters." They sat there for another minute, the man holding the bag with the money like it was a treasure, feeling a sense of safety he hadn't felt in a long time. The cold wind didn't feel so biting anymore. The city lights seemed a little brighter. In the middle of one of the biggest, loneliest cities in the world, two strangers had found a moment of perfect understanding. Keanu wasn't a star, and the man wasn't a homeless statistic. They were just two men, sharing a meal, reminding each other of their shared humanity. Eventually, the coffee cups were empty and the food was gone. The moment of quiet connection on the busy sidewalk had to come to an end. The night was getting darker, and the temperature was dropping even further as the city headed toward midnight. Keanu slowly stood up, brushing his hands against his coat to remove the dust from the pavement. He didn't jump up quickly or act like he was in a rush to escape. He moved with the same calm, deliberate pace he had shown when he first arrived. He looked down at the man one last time. The man looked different now. He wasn't just a shivering figure in the shadows, he was a man who had a full belly, a warm drink resting in his hand, and a pocket full of cash he hadn't expected. His posture was more relaxed, and the desperate look in his eyes had softened into something that looked a lot like peace. "You take care of yourself, okay?" Keanu said, his voice low but clear. He didn't say it like a command, but like a wish. The man looked up, nodding earnestly. "I will. Thanks to you. Seriously, thank you." Keanu reached out his hand. It wasn't a hand to offer a lift or to give something, it was a hand to shake. The man looked at his own dirty, grease-stained fingers for a split second, hesitating. But Keanu didn't pull away. He waited, his hand extended in the air, offering the most basic sign of respect. The man reached out and gripped Keanu's hand firmly. It wasn't a weak handshake or a pleading one, it was the handshake of equals. Two men, from completely different worlds, touching hands in the middle of New York City. "Stay warm," Keanu said with a small, genuine smile. He gave a little nod, turned around, and walked away. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for the man to say anything else. He didn't stand there waiting for a round of applause from the people walking by. He simply turned his collar up against the wind and headed down the street, melting back into the flow of pedestrians. Within seconds, he was just another face in the crowd. The magic of the moment faded into the background noise of the city, as if it had never happened. But for the man on the sidewalk, everything had changed. The man sat there for a long time after Keanu left. He finished the last sip of his coffee, holding the cup just to feel the residual heat. He reached into the bag and pulled out the folded money, staring at it in disbelief. He counted it once, then twice. It was enough. It was enough for a room in a shelter for a week, or maybe even a cheap motel for a few nights where he could lock the door and sleep safely. It was enough to buy new socks and a warm hat. It was a second chance, disguised as a burger. He looked in the direction Keanu had gone, but the street was full of people. He didn't know which one was the man who had helped him, and he realized that was the point. The help wasn't about the helper. It was about the help. Nearby, a young woman who had been waiting at a bus stop across the street had watched the entire scene unfold. She had seen the actor crouch down, seen him hand over the food, and seen him sitting on the dirty ground talking to the homeless man. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling slightly, not because of the cold, but because of what she had just witnessed. She snapped a single photo as Keanu walked away, a grainy image of his back disappearing into the night. Later that night, she would upload the photo to social media with a caption describing what happened. She didn't focus on the fact that it was a movie star. She focused on the kindness. The post would go viral, shared by millions of people who were tired of seeing bad news and hungry for a story that restored their faith in humanity. People would comment about how humble he was, how he didn't care about his clothes, and how he treated a stranger with such dignity. They would call him a hero, and a real-life angel. But miles away, In a quiet apartment, Keanu Reeves would sit down, perhaps taking off his boots, thinking about his day. He wouldn't see the online comments or the news articles. He wouldn't know that people were calling him a saint. He wouldn't care. For him, the interaction wasn't a PR stunt or a way to get attention. It was just the right thing to do. It was a moment where he saw a human being in need and had the ability to help. That was it. The true impact of the night wasn't measured in likes or shares. It was measured in the warmth that the homeless man felt as he finally stood up from the sidewalk, clutching his bag of leftovers and his newfound hope. It was measured in the fact that for one night, he wasn't invisible. He was seen. He was heard. And he was treated like he mattered. As the city lights flickered overhead and the sirens wailed in the distance, the man walked toward the nearest shelter, walking a little taller than he had when the sun went down. The cold wind was still there, but it didn't bite as hard. He had a warm meal in his stomach, money in his pocket, and the memory of a stranger sitting in the dirt just to make sure he was okay. And sometimes, in a hard world, that is enough to keep you going. The story didn't end with a parade or a trophy. It ended with a simple, quiet understanding that kindness is the most powerful force in the universe, and even in the darkest, coldest streets, a little bit of warmth can change a life forever.